Welcome everybody to our webinar today on why a culture of compliance matters. So today we'll be covering off a few different topics with our pristine panelists. We're covering off 4 areas in particular of what is the culture of compliance in the workplace, the rise of compliance over the last decade, compliant culture, who is responsible for that, and insights on how to facilitate a culture of compliance within your organization. Today, we encourage you to use our questionnaire functionality, the Q&A tools in your Zoom functions to ask our panelists some questions as we go. We've had a lot of engagement before the webinar in our registration period, and we're going to attempt to answer those during the webinar or at the conclusion. And if we don't get a chance to answer your question, don't worry, we'll look to follow you guys up in a written format afterwards. So today's presenters. Today we're lucky to have our CEO, Deborah Coram from Safetrac. So Deborah comes to us with more than 15 years experience in legal technology and compliance. She's a lawyer by experience, and she's held multiple managing director and senior leadership roles in Australia and also abroad. She's led Safetrac to becoming a multi-award-winning online compliance training organization since 2011. And she's here to be able to offer her insights and opinions for best practice compliance training. So thank you, Deborah. We're also lucky to be joined by George Karras, who is the Senior Legal Counsel at DuluxGroup. George has more than 13 years experience in senior roles at Toyota and now currently at the DuluxGroup, where he supports many of the businesses to bring their strategies to life. Working closely with business units, George advises on legal matters and appropriate risk management and commercial strategies to help enable their projects. Engaging over 3,000 staff across multiple roles and countries may seem like a daunting task, but George and the broader legal and compliance teams' passion for compliance and nurturing that compliant culture within the DuluxGroup helps to deliver a positive, engaged workplace. So thank you, George, for joining us. We also have Scott Williams, who's the Head of Enterprise and Regulatory Risk at Genworth. Scott comes to us with over 15 years experience in senior compliance, governance and risk roles, and has a wealth of knowledge on the best ESG approach for any organization. Leading Genworth across 70 lenders across Australia, including many banks and non-bank lenders, Scott ensures that the compliance activities at Genworth are robust and on point. Scott has a passion for enabling a culture of compliance within Genworth Australia, and will help businesses through this webinar today, hopefully reach their full potential, and is keen to share that enthusiasm with you all today. So I'll hand over to our CEO, Deborah Coram. Deborah, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here today. George and Scott, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate the opportunity to talk to a couple of our dear clients, and certainly a lot of our clients are ones whose culture of compliance is paramount to their business. And today's topic of culture of compliance, we'd really like to do a little bit of digging into what you do at your organisation, what works, what doesn't, and what your focus is. I, as Chris mentioned, have been with Safetrac. This is my 11th year, and I personally have witnessed a massive change in compliance over that period of time. And I've seen compliance grow from an area where a lot of people didn't have a lot of authority in an organisation. Often it was a person down in the basement that no one wanted to talk to or listen to. And we've sort of seen the rise of compliance personnel who are now sitting on a board and are extremely critical to the outlook of an organisation. And the building of that culture is almost paramount to an organisation's brand at this point in time, as we see organisations who have compliance breaches ending up on the front page of the paper for all the wrong reasons. So we've really sort of witnessed this massive 180 of compliance in a 10-year time frame. You've both been in the area, for that period of time. perhaps, Scott, I could start with you and what you've witnessed as a change over that 10-year period and where your organisation's at now in relation to its focus on compliance.
Deborah, I think I, like you, have really seen the organisation transform in terms of its understanding of compliance and its role in the organisation. It's really moved from one of a tick the box approach to one where it's seen to help enable an organisation kind of meet its strategic needs, and it's really taken I guess, like you've said, someone who's been probably sitting without that prominence to something that's quite a high profile position in the organisation. And that's a reflection, I think, of a better understanding and appreciation of the benefits of a good compliance culture within an organisation.
Thank you. And George, your perspective on it?
Yeah, similar to Scott and yourself, Deb, a massive amount of change over, I've been at DuluxGroup for about 8.5 years, and through that period, it's been a massive amount of change, not only on the attitude towards compliance within the group, but also the way we manage it and control it, the group. When I first started, compliance was 2 modules run out of a Lotus Notes database. One sort of covered appropriate workplace behaviour, and the other one was competition consumer law. And there may have been a little bit of face-to-face training for directors, and that was pretty much it. But that sort of evolved to an all-encompassing compliance program for the group that, you know, sits under the risk and compliance arm of the business and is audited externally every now and then to make sure we're filling gaps and covering the areas we need across the group, and having that full group visibility as to what is going on and what we do need to cover in our compliance program as well. So yeah, huge amount of change.
We've certainly seen the fallout from the Financial Services Royal Commission that has seen a number of changes that needed to be made at the top of organisations culturally as a result of the Financial Services Royal Commission. And really, we're sort of seeing that compliance top-down culture is utterly essential for, you know, compliance to work within an organisation. And I've always, you know, lived by the mantra, you know, the tone at the top sets the mood in the middle, creates the buzz at the bottom. And I think that's absolutely true. And when we see that lack of authenticity not coming through from the top, that's where we start to see problems. In terms of the leadership that works at both of your organisations, how far does compliance sit at the top of Genworth, Scott? And then I'll ask you, George.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. I think compliance is front and centre of the organisation, and it really is driven from the top all the way through. It's really, I think, an environment where currently you're expected to have all of the kind of the systems and the processes, etc. And there's a great awareness that culture and that lived experience across the organisation is so important. So I'm really lucky to work for an organisation that does have that tone from the top. And I think it's a big part of the environment in which we play in. We're ASX listed, we're regulated by many organisations or regulators. And we're lucky to have a board of directors that has a breadth of experience, and they bring that to bear, just reinforcing the importance of compliance across the organisation.
And George, what's happening over at Dulux in terms of your top leaders and compliance?
Yeah, definitely top down. As Scott's mentioned, when I say top down, at the board level, we have an audit and compliance committee that looks after compliance, and compliance is reported through. Our CEO is very granular when it comes to compliance issues. So he wants to know what the training numbers are when we're doing online training and things like that. And he actually challenges his GMs and wants the numbers in front of him. So when he's sitting there as a group executive, he can literally point to someone and say, why is your business dragging their heels on this particular topic? There's no excuse for it. And that consequently gets quite competitive between the GMs, because they don't want to be the ones that are dragging their heels in front of the CEO too. So it's definitely a top-down approach and led from the top.
Yeah, right.
And it always has been. I mean, we've gone from being ASX listed to being bought out and then delisted, but that hasn't changed. It's still front of centre. It's always brought up in executive meetings in various forms. So yeah, front of mind always.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe throw it to the audience to do a poll on the topic. I think, Chris, if you can put up a poll, I think there's a poll that you can put up. And we've got a poll that says, where's your organisation at in having your compliance program established? Are you just beginning? You planned and ready to execute? This is established, but it's a bit check-a-box, a bit set and forget. It's established, but we need to improve it, and it's established, but we know we need to improve it. There's two of those the same, but just answer there's obviously an error in that one. So just disregard the last one and just go with 1, 2, 3, or 4. And it'll be interesting to see where our audience is at in that. I mean, certainly in our place at Safetrac, we have organisations coming to us at all spectrums and in that lifestyle of compliance in terms of where they're actually at. We have people at the beginning of a journey and people who are sophisticated in the journey. And it's for some organisation, it's a very difficult journey to start. There's some organisations with massive cultural issues that are very, very difficult to address. I've spoken to a lot of volunteer organisations where you've got a large volunteer force that come and volunteer their services. So to try and get those sort of people to act in a certain way and to drive that sort of behaviour is very, very difficult. So there's some really big issues that go on in terms of creating that culture. Okay, well, that's great. We've established, but we know we need to improve it. So, and that would seem to be the majority of organisations that are here today, which is fabulous. And, you know, we're certainly seeing that that's the answer we should all be on, right? We can always improve all of the time. That's never something that it is a set and forget. It's a constant cycle, compliance. We identify issues, we address those issues, and we go back and we continue on that cycle. So it's never something that it's going to be perfect. In fact, I think when I first started working in compliance, which was around 11 years ago, I was talking to a client and they'd rolled out a training program, and he said he was very pleased as a result of the training program because they'd had so many people reporting incidents. And I said, oh, that's terrible, meaning that they were having a lot of incidents. And he said, no, it's the best thing that ever could have happened, because when we're getting all these incidents reported, we can do something about it. And that really is the essence of a compliant culture, is when we've got people know what's not right and they feel at ease to report them, and the organisation will do something about it. The organisation can fix them, then they don't become bigger problems. So that's certainly what we're all striving for on that compliance journey. And I don't think that's ever something that's at its pinnacle. I think that's always something that we can improve. So in terms of, I guess, facilitating that culture, and that culture where we can feel safe to report, we can feel safe to help our organisations improve, what are the sort of things that you're both doing in your organisations to facilitate that culture? Scott?
So at Genworth, I think a big part of our focus is on the uplift in terms of training and education across the breadth of our organisation. I think in order to empower your kind of people to manage their compliance obligations effectively, they really need to understand them. And that's not just kind of letter of the law. It needs, I guess you need to bring that to life with examples, with the context in terms of what the law is trying to achieve, to really embed that understanding across the organisation. We're doing that in a way that we're leveraging the relationship with Safetrac and the courses to ensure we've got this breadth of training across the board. But we're also ensuring that as a risk and compliance function, we're not hidden away in the basement. We're not kind of just following up when there's bad news. We're ensuring that we've got the right presence across the organisation, so that we're there when people have questions. We're there to help with issues and solve them. And we're also very mindful that that environment of safety to speak up is built over time and needs to be reinforced over time. And the way that we turn up to work every day and the way we kind of face into issues when they occur, even if they're kind of issues that are uncomfortable and not easy to solve, just the way that we turn up is so important as well, because that really has such a powerful influence in terms of that culture and that safety across the organisation.
And in terms of those sort of reporting metrics, what do you have in place? Do you have a whistleblower program for reporting things, or what sort of things would go through a whistleblower program versus a incident management system within your organisation?
Yeah, that's right. So I think gone are the days where I guess organisations could have an internal email address or phone number to report kind of whistleblowing concerns or kind of that support the speak up kind of function at an organisation. So we have an external firm that we partner with. By and large, we find that creating an environment where our people can talk to their people leaders or to our people and culture team or risk and compliance about the concerns that they have. First and foremost, that's the most important thing to encourage. I think incident management is there to ensure that we have the right response to things that have been identified. But we don't want people to think that our incident management systems are the way they communicate with us and the way they communicate with others. So we really want to have a healthy dialogue across the organisation. But we also recognise sometimes people are in a tough spot and they might not feel comfortable talking with some of those internal resources. And that's why we think it's really important to have an independent firm that can have truly anonymous communication were there to be something that that they weren't comfortable talking to us internally. But really, you'd hope that that's the minority of cases. But we do track metrics across all of those kind of measures, just to ensure that we're trying to listen and kind of get a pulse check on the culture on a regular basis.
Yeah, interesting. And George, can you talk to us about what happens over in Dulux in relation to facilitating that culture of compliance and what sort of things you're doing in relation to reporting and encouraging that?
It's very, very similar to Scott at Genworth as well. So ultimately, our reporting is encouraged through the management line. So reporting to your line manager, if you don't feel comfortable, then go above their head to the next manager up. We do have a speak up line, so anonymous reporting hotline that can be emailed or email or phone in various languages as well. So we've got operations in Australia, New Zealand, used to have in Asia, but now that's taken care of our Nippon parent. But we've also got operations in the UK and France as well, in Europe, so it's quite widespread. And for some issues, people, the smaller businesses, people aren't comfortable reporting through the management on certain issues. So those anonymous options are there. On top of your online training that sort of we utilise through Safetrac, we'll do a lot of internal communications as well. So you'll see posters up throughout the offices that, address our core values as a business and promote those as well. Plus, we might have some targeted campaigns about what's appropriate or inappropriate in the workplace, what's above the line, what's below the line, that sort of thing as well. So various methods, toolbox talks, for people on the shop floor. We might have targeted face-to-face training for management teams and things like that. So we utilise a variety of tools to, I suppose, not only get the message across of what we need to be aware of from a compliance perspective, but also encourage reporting so we can get on top of issues before they blow out of proportion.
Yeah. And in terms of your reporting versus internal reporting to a manager or to someone internal versus an external body, what's your sort of proportion? And I think we had an interesting question come in relation to whether a good culture would see the need for a whistleblowing tool negated, which I think, Scott, you sort of addressed to some degree in that it's there, but hopefully it's not needed, and you built that trust amongst your staff that it's not needed, but it's probably a good tool to have just in case. What's your perspective there?
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly the way that I see it. And the best conversations we can have about tools like that, the expenditure that we're making when there are, no need for, and our people are seeing no need to utilise that function. But I guess for me, I see that a culture of trust is very important, but an external whistleblower hotline, it's mandatory almost to meet your obligations these days, especially as whistleblowing reporting needs to be facilitated, not just through people that are employed currently. It's, extends to former employees, it extends to kind of spouses and relatives. So, can extend to kind of customers and suppliers. And having a tool like that can just broaden the suite of information and the ease at which people can communicate issues like that to an organisation. I think it's really important, but certainly it's the best outcome is when you're making expenditure and you're not really getting a lot of information through there, which I think as a small organisation, typically that's the experience with the Whistleblower Hotline. It's there as peace of mind, but it's not always kind of actively used week on, week out.
Yeah, and I think that we've seen a real change in organisations' perspective on compliance really being very much about ESG, which is all, where all boards are going at the moment in terms of long-term sustainability. Your ESG is critical, and we're certainly seeing that whistleblowing laws was brought in before potentially that focus when organisations didn't perhaps have it front and centre. It's almost the whistleblowing was needed for those who weren't getting on top of that culture of compliance. And now that's there, it's sort of starting to spin the wheels so that everybody's getting on board. So hopefully it is less necessary. We saw last week both KPMG and PwC voluntarily release the reports of the incidents that had been reported in their organisations and the number of reports that they'd had. I thought that was an incredibly interesting development in the world of compliance, that not only are we now not trying to kick these things under the carpet, but we're actually going to come out publicly, own them and say, these are the reports, this is what's happened in our organisation. We're going to be honest about it. We've got some issues. We're not saying we're perfect. These are the issues we've got. These are the issues we're working on. How far do you think that we are away, George, from us all joining that type of thing? And how far away is it from certainly, maybe publicly listed companies that becomes an area in which organisations' shareholder value is linked to those type of issues?
It's an interesting one. I can't see anywhere in the near future where people would voluntarily disclose that information without there being, I suppose, a self-serving purpose to it. So that was an interesting one that you have a couple of big accounting firms. So I suppose in the past, everyone knows you work for a big firm, you work hard, you do the long hours, and there's always issues in big organisations. There's always issues and allegations of bullying and the like, and things like that. And if there have been, I suppose, if there have been cultural issues in the past that have been brought to light, then absolutely it builds. Disclosing that sort of information builds trust with the community and shows that the senior management actually has it front of mind and is addressing it and looking to address it. So, yeah, you look at what's the word I'm thinking of? I suppose socially responsible investment. When you're looking at the stock market and companies on the stock market, there's a bit of that going on. So these sorts of disclosures would be not necessarily related to compliance, but maybe other areas of the business that they'd look to disclose as well to build that trust and promote their business and use it as a marketing tool for the business as well, and say, hey, look, that might not turn around and say, hey, we're not perfect, no one's perfect, but we're working hard at getting there, and this is the direction we're heading.
Scott, what's your perspective? Do you see a day where Genworth might report their issues publicly?
I'm not sure if I'm in the position to talk about Genworth specifically, but I certainly think, like you mentioned, the Royal Commission into Financial Services earlier. We've all seen how conduct and compliance issues can manifest in reputational concerns and really degrade shareholder value. So I think as we've seen the rise in the importance within organisations around the kind of a good compliance culture, I think it's only natural that over time the disclosure of metrics to help investors really get a sense of how well that culture is being embedded in an organisation makes sense. Is it in the near term? We're probably still a little bit on the journey, but it's great to see organisations that, even if they might be doing it for a little bit of a self-serving reason and to address some lack of trust, but at least they're in a position to perhaps lead the way on what the future might look like.
I might actually throw it at that point over to a poll. Chris, if you can put up the next poll, please, so that we're going to have a look at where your assessment of your organisation's culture and attitude is towards compliance. We've got very engaged, disengaged, indifferent, engaged, very engaged. So I'm going to guess, based off the last poll, that we'll probably see some engaged and very engaged here being the predominant answers, but you would think that those with a focus on it and that would also have a pretty engaged culture. So I suspect that those two will be linked. Of course, this comes down to whether we're doing things to check a box or whether we really care. So I guess the answer to this shows whether or not we're checking boxes or we actually do care about these type of things. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And I think what we're seeing is that compliance increasingly is creating front page news in all sorts of topics that previously it wasn't necessarily. So sexual harassment, Brittany Higgins, these sort of issues have come up. And there you go. Well, that's interesting, actually. I expected a different outcome to that. So we've got very engaged and engaged being the majority, but still, given the large majority of people saying that it was important, but with their culture and attitude being indifferent, which would indicate, I guess, a disparity between the two, potentially a check the box attitude. Scott, George, how would you interpret the disparity between those two results?
Yeah, I think the level of engagement would typically depend on the seniority of the person, and the management level, I think, is the biggie. So you might have highly engaged at the senior management and leadership level, but then as you progress down the organisation, you get I suppose the typical attitude of, well, it's not my job, I don't get remunerated for it, there's no benefit for me out of it. So they're probably relatively disengaged from a compliance perspective. There's a very broad brush approach, but it's obviously not the case in all areas. But I think it sort of filters down. And even when you got the push from the top, as you sort of move down, it's like, well, oh God, there's another reminder to do my compliance training, right? I don't have time for this. I've got to make my sales, etc., and things like that. And it gets pushed to the side. And unless there's a bit more of an accountability, I suppose, and constant reporting and reminder throughout the organisation, then you're going to get that disparity between the top end and the top-down push, and then the bottom end of the organisation, where people just want to get their job done. Basically, they don't care about the higher-level corporate issues. They just want to make sure they do their job and do it well, because that's what's important to them. Yeah, but I suppose the hard thing is to get the message across that a culture of compliance is important across the board. It's not just the top end. It's something that needs to be driven throughout the organisation in order for the organisation as a whole to perform. But yeah, I think that's probably why we see a bit of a disparity.
Yeah, Scott?
I mean, I think if I was to answer that question honestly, I might mean an all of the above as well. I think I agree with George. You certainly, as you collect data through internal surveys, I think engagement surveys are very important, and when they have kind of questions to help assess the compliance culture and the risk culture for an organisation, you really can see that, depending on the level that an individual sits within the organisation, there might be a bias to looking at things more favourably, and areas where it might not, I guess the messaging might not be cutting through. But I guess that also highlights then, when you look across an organisation, the experience can really differ from function to function, and it can differ over time. It can depend on leadership at the time, changes within the organisation, and I guess the thing that it highlights for me in a role wanting to promote the importance of a compliance culture is that importance of regular measurement and assessment of the data, because it just won't be transparent if you're sitting in a role, how exactly the message is cutting through across the organisation. So that data to support where things might be working, but really to identify where things might not be working, and trying to unpick why that is. Because once you know, you can come up with strategies about engaging at all levels of the organisation. And I guess a big one that we're focusing on at the moment is at our people leader level. We've noticed in the past we've had a lot of communications from a top-down perspective. We've given a lot of education to employees across the board. But if we ask ourselves the question, have we supported our people leaders to know what their role is in helping to support a compliance culture? We've seen that as an area where we can probably enhance what we do. So getting that data is really important.
Yeah, that's critical. We had a point come through during that discussion of somebody saying the organisation might be willing, but they don't have the budget. So this comes down to the issue of compliance not being given the requisite budget, and certainly at Safetrac, I can't tell you how many organisations we speak to, and we'll be speaking to someone, and they want our stuff. They want our training, they want to roll it out. They can't get approval for it. We've got other organisations, they're like, they've got the money to do whatever they like because it's been given priority. I mean, I guess it really comes down to the prioritisation of it in the business. Where do you see the budget issue for compliance, and how critical should it be for an organisation? And how does an organisation out there today who's listening here, and a person who can't get that budget to do the necessary things, how do they go about getting that? Any hints? Tricks, tips?
I think making sure that compliance is front and centre at a board and a senior management perspective is really the key starting point. If you haven't helped embed the importance at that level, it's going to be very hard to have a discussion on kind of funding and costing, because you'll be probably in a situation where there isn't that appreciation of the importance of embedding a compliance culture. I guess I'm lucky for the organisation I work with that the cost is never an issue. I think what we struggle with most is how do we deploy the resources within the risk and compliance team to support and embed and make the most of the resources that we have available. Because it's often how we spend our time day to day and how we turn up and talk about issues, and that really makes the most difference in terms of a compliance culture. So actually I might end with my key message would be just focus on what's within your control. Where are you spending your time and effort? Are you kind of looking at the external landscape, feeding back to directors and senior leaders stories in terms of other experiences across the industry you work in? And are you helping to make compliance kind of front and centre in their minds? Because once you win that battle, you might find other things like budget become easier discussions.
George, do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, similar to Scott. But I think the other, I suppose, sweetener that you can provide when you're talking about budget and getting budget is the cost and consequence of getting it wrong, and how that compares to the spend on compliance. So, if you get an information request from the ACCC as an example, you're going to churn up a couple of $100,000 in legal fees just responding to that request on the one part. And that you might not have any issue whatsoever, but you still got to respond to the request. And then that obviously increases exponentially if they decide to investigate further, and nothing might come of it. But you're still spending the money and churning the money. And then, if you do have an issue, then there's the fines on top of that. So I think the cost and consequence of getting it wrong is a good way to push budget for compliance. But then again, if you've done that and your budget is stretched, then you probably really need to look at what really matters to you from a compliance perspective. So you can't cover everything because you just don't have the budget. What are the key risks that we really need to address, and try and manage your budget around those, because they're the things that might have the dire consequences to the business, whereas other areas might not be as important.
We certainly see compliance becoming ever increasing. Just when we might have our hands around one area of compliance, we get a new one. Modern slavery obviously has come down, and the expense with that, complying with that legislation, is actually quite enormous to do it properly and to do it well. If we were to all fully investigate our supply chain lines, you'd really have to go to every individual supplier and look at their practices rather than just asking them to complete a statement. So actually what is compliance? Is it, checking the box, or is it really doing it carefully? And we also see from a training perspective, when people do talk to us about training, we'll often be being compared with maybe somebody that does what we do a little cheaper, but it's sort of a checker box training. It's written text and you go from slide to slide and that's it. There's no interactivity, there's no sort of learning outcomes from it. And we'll say, well, how do we justify paying for this versus getting that? I'm still doing the training. There's a real difference in learner outcomes in checking a box and doing it well. If you're going to make your staff go through training and they're going to check that box and they're going to have to spend an hour checking that box, you can either have that hour of productivity result in something where staff understand what it is that they've just been trained in, that resonates with them, that was customized to their own environment, that was about their role and what they do. That training is going to make sense to that person, and hopefully they understand it, and hopefully there's a business outcome from it that means you'll have compliant staff. That comes back to the point, is what is the cost of not doing this right? If you're just going to check a box, you're going to waste all those hours of productivity, but you're not actually going to get the outcome of people understanding what it is they're meant to be doing or not meant to be doing in their roles at the same time. So this is sort of an opportunity to ensure that we are teaching our staff what is and isn't okay. And it's not really an area to be saving money on. I'd be happy to talk to anyone's organisation about that if that were necessary. And moving on from that topic onto one of my age-old favourite topics of carrot and stick. And we hear a lot about this in compliance terms. Do we encourage our staff to compliance, or do we crack them harsh with a stick when they're not, or is it a bit of both? And we see the same with regulators. We encourage people to do things and organisations to do things, but if they don't, there's a fine or a punishment. And we often see things like the Privacy Act come in without recrimination, but we slowly see the penalties rise. So we give them a chance to do it. And then when they don't, we start building up the recriminations. I think we'll probably see similar in the Modern Slavery Act. There's a bit of name and shame there, but there's not actually a fine or anything for being compliant. We see this whole carrot and stick approach in relation to the rollout of training and getting high completion rates. We have some organisations that demand 100% completion rate of their staff, and we have some that operate on 80 or 90. And as a forgiveness point, we're increasingly seeing that change, because why do you want 20% of your staff running around not knowing what they should be doing? That's a very high risk factor. So we're starting to see this real drive towards 100% by a certain date. And we saw an client last year cut off all IT systems to staff if training wasn't completed by a specific date. That's probably the largest stick I've seen in a pretty long time. Also, a lot of work for the IT department to get everybody back and running again at a future date. So the consequence for the organisation is actually quite large from that. So that is the importance with which they view compliance. As it's an essential thing, you cannot continue to work here if you're not compliant. Where do your organisations sit in terms of carrot and stick? More stick, more carrot, bit of both? George, how do you go about it?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. To give you an example, everyone who gets a bonus, who is entitled to a bonus in the organisation, part of their bonus is based on us achieving our requirements with respect to our safety targets. So that's compliance and reporting from a safety perspective. So that's not negotiable. It's a percentage of everyone's bonus. If we don't hit our targets, no one gets that part of their bonus. Simple as that. To drive a culture of compliance from a safety perspective. Thankfully, it's not necessarily needed overall, but that's there as well. I think from a broader compliance perspective, absolutely the carrot works. So if it's tied to an incentive, be it financial or otherwise, you're going to get a high level of compliance. In our organisation, it comes from the name, as I touched on earlier, it's a bit of naming and shaming in the senior management group as to, you know, why is your business dragging its heels? Why are your numbers at 80% versus the business next year that's at 95? And And our CEO always asks the question, he goes, why aren't we at 100? Why can't we get to 100? The tools are there, the reporting is there. We should be at 100% compliance. There should be no excuse.
Yeah.
So it's balancing that and trying to get the message down the chain more than anything else of how important it is. And yeah, I think unfortunately, unless there is an incentive there for a lot of people, they're just not going to turn their mind to it as much as they should.
And Scott, over at Genworth?
Genworth, well, firstly, I saw a comment come in through chat around non-attendance at the Christmas party, which might not have meant as much in the last couple of years as what I had previously, but it's definitely a good idea, so I'll take that one on board too. One of the initiatives I took when I joined Genworth a couple of years ago was to ensure that as part of the performance review, we didn't just have measures for discussion with people leaders and their staff, that as a function, we provided the data to our people and culture team as well. So that it wasn't a discussion that the compliance function needed to have with the organisation, but we empowered the people and culture team to then also work with people leaders to have better discussions where that data was showing that people were prioritising kind of work outside of ongoing training and education. So that was, and I think that had quite a powerful impact in terms of compliance training completion, and it certainly flipped the discussion away from, why aren't the compliance team following people up even more to get them to do the compliance training? And maybe my attitude of, well, that's not my job. Everyone else needs to complete the training. But for me, I'll provide the data, provide the transparency, and empower leadership to then have those discussions within their teams. And I think that's quite a powerful message.
Yeah, it's on a similar vein to that, we see the whole carrot and stick is in relation to the marks and how we do pass rates and assessments on training. We see a really large raft of different things going on different organisations. We see some who just want to pass, just a completion. They've done the training, they don't need to do an assessment. Excuse me. We see some who need 80% pass mark. Excuse me. And we see others with 100% requirement on pass mark. And what are you insisting upon in your organisations and why?
Well, I might keep going and give you a chance to have a glass of water. In our organisation, we do tailor the approach on a course-by-course basis. We've recently rolled out a new code of conduct for the organisation that took a very legalistic kind of 60-page code down to 3 pages, which is more values-based and action-based. For that, to produce a training on a 3-page code, a long list of exam questions and a pass mark didn't make a lot of sense, but we do require formal acknowledgement that everyone's read and understood that document. Whereas for others, and say privacy could be a good example, there are a few technicalities there. And so we do want to have an exam at the end where everyone taking that course does need to show a level of proficiency. And for a small organisation, or relatively small, that's kind of where we've gotten to. But where we see the future is really how do we digest the data in terms of what are the questions that teams are getting wrong? Is there a trend in terms of a knowledge gap for an area? And how can we use that information to target the further kind of training and education and engagement from our team with the broader organisation? I think, it's always a journey and you're looking to do things better all the time. And that's certainly an area that we're looking to do better at.
Yeah, great. I think that at 2:47, I know that we've had a huge amount of questions, some of which were wonderful questions that we really did want to turn our attention to. Chris, can I turn to you at this point to run that question bank?
Absolutely. So we had a couple of questions around this topic, and I'll throw it to you, Deb. What indicators do you look to assess the culture of compliance in your organisation? So how do you measure culture?
I think that's a really interesting question. There's multiple ways to manage culture. I think you can look at things like staff retention. We can look at factors that affect things like reporting and we certainly want to make sure that we're doing things like surveying staff and ensure that we're capturing their feedback in relation to how they're finding their experience in the organisation. As a leader, I personally find that ensuring that all staff understand that there's an open book policy, everyone can always come and report something somewhere, that there's no issue that's going to go under the carpet, and that there's always going to be authenticity and transparency with responses, I think are critical things. I'm not sure, George, Scott, do you have a feedback on that in relation to that?
Yeah, it's a hard one to quantify, because obviously notification and identification of potential issues are a good measure, because it means people do have the issues front of mind and can spot the issues of compliance and are comfortable raising them. You'd hope it wouldn't happen too often, but it's one way to show staff are aware and can identify issues. The number of regulatory investigations and prosecutions is probably not a good measure, because obviously there's companies clearly out there flouting the law that haven't been caught, or no one's raised an issue with them. So that's probably not a good one. It's for me, working in the legal team, I think the questions and issues that are raised with you and issues that are flagged with you is also a good measure to see whether the message is getting through. Yep. Because we tend to deal with a wide variety of, I suppose, the middle to upper management, not so much the lower level, but it's a good measure of whether the message is getting through and people understand what compliance is and what needs to be reported and identifying issues.
Yeah, I think also always that we're seeing things that are getting reported on it, so that the issues are getting recorded. So I think probably if you're getting no issues, I think that you've probably got a small issue there, because the reality is there's always going to be problems. You can have a health and safety, focus on your business, but if you're also going to be running a business, so from time to time there's going to be hazards, there's going to be issues, and if they're not going to be reported, then they can't be fixed. And that applies with every area of compliance. So we want to see people actually raising issues. I think that's a really good sign of your culture if people are raising those issues with management and through a reporting system.
Thanks, guys. I might throw this one over to Scott, being the head of risk at Genworth. There's a couple of questions around risk. So how do you best align risk and compliance, and how does this impact culture? And another one was around, where does risk tolerance sit in a compliance culture, if at all? Scott, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. I think it's a great question, and one that I know organisations do grapple with. Compliance in some organisations is a standalone function, and in others it's a combined function. And I really do believe that whilst compliance is a specialised discipline, many organisations are combining kind of risk and compliance functions, and the concept of risk culture and compliance culture more generally. I mean, culture is really just that lived experience across the organisation, and you can live that experience from a risk perspective, you can live that from a compliance perspective, you can live that from many other different dimensions as well. And I think there's always, I think just the importance of that for an organisation is just always needs to be front and centre. So what we look for is we look for what are the measures that can demonstrate a good forward-looking measure of conduct and culture, and others that can kind of validate that in terms of the lived experience for the organisation. So forward-looking are things around, sorry, I'm just losing my place there. So forward-looking can be things we've talked about in terms of training and education. How well are people completing that? What's their pass mark? What are the messages coming out of that? And backward-looking indicators can more be incidents, breaches, and kind of what's gone wrong in the organisation. So I think a balance of those, but certainly risk culture and compliance culture are very intertwined.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question we had from our audience was, how do you recognise the unwritten rules within your organisation? Might throw over to George for that one.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It probably comes down to the core values of your organisation, as they'll invariably underpin and give rise to the unwritten rules around what is and isn't acceptable within that organisation. Many companies will have, I suppose, what you can call their motherhood statements and their core values and what they live by. But it's one thing to have them, another thing to enforce them or put them into action. In order to recognise them, there probably should be enough communication to employees to enable them to recognise what is and isn't acceptable to an organisation, and therefore that gives rise to the unwritten rules. So that'll come through compliance training, actually doing your modules and what we actually value from a compliance perspective. So what does the compliance program for the company look like? Like, what are the key risks and issues that it addresses? They sort of underpin what would be the unwritten rules. And then combining that with just consistent messaging at various levels. So, you could be delivering targeted face-to-face training to a manager of group, through to putting posters up around the communal kitchen on certain issues, versus taking time out in toolbox talks on the shop floor to address potential issues and things like that they sort of will address what I suppose you'd call the unwritten rules of what you can and can't do within an organisation, or what is and is not acceptable.
Brilliant. Thank you. There's been some chat around this sort of area within the webinar, but also prior to, and I'll get you all to really, I guess, get involved in this one. What sort of tips and tricks do you offer to get people to actually engage in their compliance training? How do you get the board involved in taking compliance training seriously and get people involved in doing that compliance training? Might throw over to you, Deb, for that one to start off with.
Well, I'd probably just throw that one over to George and Scott on that one, Chris, just simply because they're the ones with boards. So I'd be really interested in their organisation's perspectives on that point with their boards, just because I'm aware we've got a short amount of time. And there's a question I really want to answer.
I'll be quick then, Deb. Naming and shaming definitely works. I guarantee you, particularly at the senior management level. But even lower down, that certainly plays a part. I think the other way is, and we've touched on it from time to time. There was a couple of comments I noticed that came through the feed as well. I think incentivising compliance is another biggie. There needs to be ways and means of doing it. There might not be monetary incentives, but there are various ways you can incentivise compliance, and I think they're probably two key ones. Yep.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the board are really looking for a validation around their investment in terms of the time and effort that the organisation is spending on training. And that's really where we get challenged most. How do we demonstrate the benefits of the training? Certainly my experience working with Safetrac over the last couple of years has been just more positive feedback from senior management and employees when the training's delivered in a short and engaging way, and the information really cuts through. So people kind of really do come to you and have corridor conversations around, wow, I actually really enjoyed that and I got a lot out of it and I now understand the topic, so thank you. And those messages, when they get replayed back to the board independently, when those questions are asked of you, are really powerful to demonstrate that things are working effectively.
Absolutely. And it's a really good idea to try and harness that. We see a lot of clients include feedback at the end of a course. How'd you find this? How was it? Just in terms of garnering that feedback and then having specific KPIs around what they want to see for that, and whether that's a KPI on learner feedback or whether it's a KPI of an active action in the organisation. We had a client this year who rolled out a driver safety training program, and their KPI is they wanted to reduce their driver incidents. In actual fact, they've reduced their driver incidents by 20% in 6 months since rolling out training. That's a massive change, and they hadn't even expected that. So I think it's nice if we can start looking at compliance actually making an active change in your organisation, and that potentially we can set some KPIs around what we'd like to see. Is it that as a result of the training, we want to see an increase in reports? Is it, you know, what is the KPI and what's the purpose of us doing this? And I think if we can go back to a purpose, that can also help us to get budget. Because I guarantee you, if you can go to your board and say, hey, we reduced our driver incidents by 20% as a result of rolling out a course, can I please have some money next year to build this? You'll get a yes straight away. So you start to be able to put measurable monetary factors associated with learning outcomes. That's really, really important.
Wonderful. We've got time for one more, and yes, I will ask this one to you, Deb. It is one of the favourite ones that came through on our registration. So thank you again, everyone, for providing your questions prior to the session as well as during. So this last question is, compliance can often seem hard, serious and scary. How can we soften and make compliance more approachable and friendly? Deb.
So I get excited by this question because this is the question that, you know, sort of floats my boat. I don't actually like compliance as a term. I think compliance sounds mean, it seems harsh. Everybody hears compliance and runs the other way. So I love the example. We have a client we've worked with many years in New Zealand, and they have a wonderful culture of compliance and approach to compliance. And when they rolled out the compliance training, they don't call it compliance training, they call it integrity training. And they started doing that around 10 years ago. Their whole thing is called integrity training. Now, I think when you start to approach your training from that perspective, you're calling it something different in your organisation, and you're approaching it with a different mindset. I'm not doing this because I have to. I'm not doing it because it's nasty regulatory law stuff. Compliance is a horrible word. I'm doing it because our organisations acts with integrity. And when we look at the background in every single piece of legislation, the background of legislation is about protecting people. It's about giving them their rights. It's about making sure that our workplaces are healthy, safe places for our workers to come to work. And if we can start to look at the human element of legislation, why do we have this? AML sounds really harsh, but if we could stop people being enslaved, if we could stop children in the sex slave trade, and that's what AML's about, well, all of a sudden that becomes a topic that I want to know about. And I want to make sure that our organisation is not involved in any aspect of that. So I think humanising the reasons behind compliance and it being about the human factor is a really important way. And I think if all of our leaders can engage in it from that point of view, we're not doing this because we have to. We're doing it because we want our workplace to be safe. We're doing it because we don't want to be partnering with somebody who's got slaves in the back room. We're doing this because this is the integrity with which our organisation operates. And I think if we can all take that as a lesson in how to start to frame compliance, then we start to look at it in a really different way. And if I could relabel what we do as integrity training, I would, but no one would search for me on Google. And that is the only reason that I continue to call it compliance training. Otherwise, if I were you and your organisations, I would be relabeling it integrity training as a starting point.
That's a great response. Thank you, Deb. That brings us to the end of our webinar, just right on 3 o'clock. So we really appreciate everyone's attendance and everyone's involvement as well. And a big thanks again to George at DuluxGroup and Scott at Genworth. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being our key panelists for today. And thanks, Deborah, for hosting that one and leading us through the culture of compliance. Thanks, everybody.
Fabulous. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed the session. And thank you, Scott, and thank you, George. Very much.
You're welcome. Thanks, Deb.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.